So as we continue working through Chapter 14, remember we just completed the first line of defense. So we just talked about the outer barriers and the chemicals, the genetic advantages that are associated with blocking microbes from the portal of entry. And so in the next couple of sections, we're going to continue working through the second and third lines of defense. And so this is actually known as immunology. So it's the study of your immunity based on the second and third lines. And so this is kind of piggybacking off of Objective 2. And at the same time, we're going to be moving through Objectives number 4, 5, and 6 in this unit, in this Part B of Chapter 14. So as far as the immune system is concerned, you have three primary functions. So surveillance of the body, so that's one of the things the immune system is doing, is constant surveillance, constantly watching and checking what's going on in the body. Second is recognizing and differentiating normal versus foreign. So as we're doing surveillance, as we're checking cells, being able to identify the cells that should be in our body versus the cells that should not. And then finally, it's attacking those that should not be here. So attacking and destroying the entities that are foreign and could potentially be harmful. And so one of the major ways that we do this is through white blood cells. Okay, so we know fancy word for white blood cell is a leukocyte. We're going to talk about some specific ones by name in just a moment, but they are the cells that have the ability to distinguish self from non-self. And those are terms that you want to make sure that you're aware of. So self, these are those normal cells in the body. Non-self, these are the foreign cells. So anything that does not belong here, anything that's not supposed to be here. And so we said that the first part of this immunity, it's the immune surveillance, right? It's that ability to seek out and to recognize self from non-self, okay? And then from there, attacking the things that are non-self while not attacking the things that are self. You know, healthy cells should remain unharmed unless you have some type of autoimmune disease, and we'll look at those we get in Chapter 16. So an exception here is obviously cancer. We know those are abnormal or damaged self cells, but they're their own category, and so we won't deal with them at this point. And so some components of this immune system that they mentioned here, some compartments they mentioned, is you have what's called the RES, so the reticuloendothelial system. And so if you break that down, reticula, that's connective tissue, has a lot of reticular connective fibers in there. We talk about endothelial, so some cells that are kind of mixed in there, and the liquids that will be found in with them, phagocytic cells like macrophages. We also mentioned extracellular fluid, also known as ECF, lymph fluid, the bloodstream, and then the lymphatic system. So these are the different compartments that contain all these immunoresponsive cells that are going to play a huge role in recognizing self from foreign and then attacking the foreign entities. You can kind of see some pictures here of those things. So again, one of the main focuses that we want to look at here are the cells. Now, we know if we were to go in your bloodstream right now, we would find three primary lines of cells. So we would find what are known as platelets, and platelets are actually fragments of cells. You can call them, the fancy word is thrombocytes. And what these platelets do is they help in clotting, right? So when you are bleeding and you want to stop bleeding, it's the platelets that stick together to form that clot. Okay. You also know that in your bloodstream you have erythrocytes, fancy word for red blood cells. And remember, red blood cells, their main job is transport. So transporting oxygen and nutrients throughout our body and helping to transport the waste materials like carbon dioxide out. And then you have the leukocytes, the white blood cells. They're the ones that are responsible for a large majority of your immune function. Now, if you look at objective number 5, it mentions that we have 5 types of white blood cells. And so what we want to do is we want to look at each one of these and figure out actually what they do. So what role do they play in regards to your immune system? So we start with the first 3 on the screen. These are considered to be the granulocyte white blood cells. Okay, now when we call them granulocytes, it just means if you look at each of these white blood cells, if you look at them close up, you'll see granules inside of them. So the way that I always try to remember this is that the 3 that are end in "-fil" are filled with granules. So they're the granulocytes. So we start with the first one, the neutrophils. So neutrophils, very simply, are phagocytic cells. So their main job is to eat bacteria, or to eat the large majority of microbes that may make their way into your system. So they're phagocytic, they're going to engulf those bacterial cells. The second one they mentioned are the eosinophils. So these destroy eukaryotic pathogens like parasites. Okay, so the eosinophils are going to be the ones that are going to attack worms. They're going to attack protozoans. They're also going to be the main ones that cause an allergic response, and we'll talk more about those in chapter 16 when we deal with allergies and allergens. You also have the basophils. So basophils, their key role is to release some chemical mediators. So they release things like histamine, they release things like heparin. Histamine we know is what actually leads to inflammation. Heparin is an anticoagulant. Coagulation means to clump. So heparin keeps your blood from clumping so that materials can continue flowing to the areas where you need them. So basophils are basically chemical producing cells. So then the other two are what we call the agranulocyte white blood cells. So put A in front of a word, it means without. Right, so agranulocytes, these are the white blood cells that do not have those granules inside of them. And if you look, these are the two that end in site. So the way that I always remembered it is that the ones that end in site, you have to remember there are no granules in site. Right, so that's an easy way to kind of remember those. So if we look at these in a little more detail, you have the lymphocytes. So the lymphocytes are actually heavily responsible for your third line of defense. So they're the ones that are responsible for that adaptive, very specific immune response. And it's all about two types of lymphocytes. So you have what we call the B cells and the T cells. Now you're going to hear more about these a little bit later on. But for now, just note that the B cells, they have the job of producing antibodies. So when you are exposed to a foreign pathogen, hopefully they produce an antibody that will allow you later on to attack them if you ever see that type of foreign pathogen again. T cells, it mentions, they have this role of actually killing foreign cells. And so again, we'll talk more about those a little bit later on. And then finally, you have the last category of white blood cells. So you have what we call the monocytes, also known as macrophages. They are non-specific, and they look at their name. Macro means big, phage means to eat. So literally, they are big eaters. Their job is to scavenge, so find foreign pathogens, find foreign cells, process those, destroy them. They also may clean up debris. They also may clean up some of your own dead cells or even damaged cells. And so these are your 5 types of white blood cells. And so you can kind of see there's a table in your book. 14.2 kind of compares all of these. Be something good to look at as you're kind of studying through, making sure you know the difference in these 5 types of cells. Okay. So we also mention on object number 6 the lymphatic system. Okay, so if you take Anatomy 2, you'll talk heavily about this system. Lymphatic system typically is mentioned right after the circulatory system. So if you think circulatory / cardiovascular, so that system is the one that contains the blood cells. And so what we know is that as your heart is pumping blood through your body, it requires a lot of pressure to do that. And so sometimes in pushing that blood out of your heart and through those blood vessels with a lot of pressure, it actually causes some of the liquid from your blood to get pushed into cells. Now, we don't want that liquid to stay in our cells because too much water in our cells, right, can cause them to burst. And so one role of the lymphatic system is to collect that released fluid. We call it lymph, okay? So to collect that liquid that's been pushed out of circulation, to filter it and then put it back into the bloodstream. And so it mentions it's kind of a drain-off system, but one of the things it does in that drain-off system is it does filter the liquid before it goes back into your bloodstream. And as it's filtering it, it's doing surveillance, it's recognizing, it's also protecting against foreign materials. And so if we look at the lymphatic system, it's all the stuff that's listed in green here. So you have lymph vessels that go around. Lymph vessels typically are connected to lymph nodes, which you've probably heard of before. Also a part of the lymphatic system are your tonsils. And that makes sense, right? Because you think about when you get sick and you're fighting off an infection, a lot of times they'll get swollen or get enlarged. The thymus, the spleen, all play a huge role in the lymphatic system. And so you can kind of see here how your cardiovascular / circulatory system is interconnected with the lymphatic system. So as your arteries are pushing out liquids, the lymphatic system grabs those, filters them, and then puts it back into the venous drainage that leads back to your heart. And that's the end of this section.